Hey, welcome everyone to today's devotional. I'm going to start a series of posts which I've entitled Isms That Are Killing the Church. An ism is usually a suffix put on a word, but when that appears, an ism is a distinctive doctrine or theory, philosophy. We have lots of isms: nationalism, Buddhism, Hinduism, narcissism, atheism, capitalism, socialism, and so forth. We have a ism probably for almost every schema of thinking. But I'm going to be talking about the isms, which I think are particularly dangerous for the Christians and the church, because they represent belief systems which Christians hold. They're in the church themselves. They're not necessarily something attacking the church from outside, but it is doctrine teaching beliefs within the church itself. The one I'm going to start with today is Deism. Ism, of course, meaning a belief, a doctrine. And the first part of the word comes from the Latin word dea, which means God. So it seems literally to be a belief in God, which doesn't sound like such a bad thing, does it? But Deism, not so good. Deism was the belief system that's been attributed to a lot of our founding fathers, Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, to name a few. And it has a lot of variants. I'm not going to be talking about it generally, but I'm going to be looking at a variant or two, which I think is still in Christian thinking. But Deism generally believed that revelation comes through observation of the natural world. It denies revelation from God. It's reason and our minds which human beings need to discover truth, whether that's scientific truth or religious truth. And ironically, some of the origins of Deism can be traced to really a Christian man who was really one of the great thinkers in the church. This is Thomas Aquinas. He was an Italian theologian, lived in I think it was the 13th century. And Aquinas said that there are two sources of knowledge about God. One is revelation, divine revelation, and the other one is natural reason. He believed that we could look at God's creation and almost prove the existence of God, as well as understanding a lot about God. And this aspect of knowledge is in fact, I think, biblical. Psalm 19 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God." And if you read the first chapter of Romans near the end, it says that the qualities of God are revealed through his creation. But what happened after Aquinas, and as Europe especially moved into the Renaissance, there was a increase in study of science and Greek philosophy and so forth, that natural revelation started to take precedence over divine revelation. And so man, over the following centuries, realized how smart he was and that he could figure out things for himself. Well, that brings us to the 17th century and Isaac Newton, also a very committed and dedicated Christian. Well, I think most of you know the story about the apple falling on his head, but one of Newton's great contributions, and he had many of them, was to render planetary motion and gravity into mathematical formulas. So looking at the universe, it wasn't just simply a God is holding everything in place, but that there were these physical laws which helped to define the motion of planets and the impact of gravity. As I said, Newton was a dedicated Christian, but with this revelation, people began to think, what do we need God for? We have Newton, we have science. These things are adequate in and of themselves to explain how things work. Prior to Aquinas and Newton, mankind had no problem believing that God held everything together and everything happened because of God or the gods. But by Newton's time, and certainly afterwards, things had changed. And with Newton especially came this doctrine that the universe is a clock. I'm speaking about a sort of a worldview that would include God and tried also to accommodate the scientific discoveries that were being made. And so mankind postulated that, well, God did create the universe, but it's kind of a clock. It's a big machine that he wound up, and now it's winding down. And some theologians pointed to Romans 8:20, thinking that it was pointing to this clockwork analogy. And that scripture reads, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God." And some saw in this kind of winding down of this cosmic clock that God had created. And so this form of deism that arose out of this thinking is what many of our founding fathers believed, that God did create the universe, but he wound it up, got it going, and he sits back, and mankind, with their free will, they are free agents to sort of figure out for themselves what they need to do. This isn't a world of miracles, but it's a world of physical laws that God set into place. And this form of deism is theistic in that these deists, Jefferson, Franklin, and so forth, did believe in God. But again, it was a God who sat back and let man do his thing, more or less. And you might think, well, I don't believe that. But I want to raise some scenarios for you, because I do think that deism has crept into our thinking, if not our theoretical thinking, it's crept into our actual thinking, our day-to-day living. Well, getting back to this issue of divine revelation, there are Christians out there who don't believe that there is any more revelation coming from God. We got it all in Scripture. He doesn't speak today. He doesn't prophesy. There are no apostles. There are no words from God anymore. Some of these are termed as cessationists, that some of the gifts of the Spirit no longer are functioning. And one of these individuals is John MacArthur on the West Coast. Has a big church, and I'm a great respecter of John MacArthur, but I disagree with him on this point. I think God still does speak to us today. He is not changing his doctrine. We are not getting any new doctrine about the church and Jesus Christ, but I think, if I'm considering a new job offer, that God can speak to me and guide me, and so forth. I think MacArthur might be appalled that somebody would be toying with a label of deism, but sort of is what it is. But getting back to this idea that, kind of the world is motoring along on its own, and you might think, no, I don't believe that. Well, but let's take the issue of weather. Do you think weather is simply a result of Earth's rotation and the interaction of cold and warm fronts? And when you hear the meteorologists speaking about hurricanes and tornadoes, well, these things can be explained scientifically. Or do you believe that the weather that we experience every day is by the actual hand of God? Do you think that major seismic events, earthquakes, tsunamis, simply result from tectonic plates, continental plates that are moving, sliding over one another, producing these seismic disturbances? Or do you see the hand of God when events like this take place? Is history merely the result of men's free will and the decisions that they make, or do you believe that it's the guiding hand of God on mankind, that we've had the kind of history that has occurred? I know that when we have a beautiful weather for our picnic, often I hear we thank God for that. But when you plan a day out with your family and it rains, often we say nothing, at least about God being involved. Were you ever in a car accident and you were spared? And I've heard lots of testimonies praising God for sparing you and for His protection. However, when there's an accident and people die, or your car perhaps is totaled, we say very little, But Job understood that all the things that came in his life were from God. The abundance, his children, his wealth, these were gifts from God. But when those things were taken away, when his sons were killed, when his wealth was lost, when his health went south, he saw that as the hand of God as well. And I'm not sure that we have that kind of perspective. And I think if we don't, we are bordering on deistic thinking, as if it's coincidence or natural law and so forth, the reason why things take place. It's almost as if when it comes to negative, painful, calamitous things, we perhaps are trying to protect God's reputation by keeping Him distant, not seeing Him as a cause and involved in those things. I think that's kind of deistic in the thinking. If you look in Scripture, clearly God is linked to all of those things, even plagues, pandemics, like the coronavirus. There are Christians who perhaps see calamity, everything painful, disease, and so forth, just as works of the devil. They might not be deists in that they are ascribing kind of a supernatural involvement, but this kind of thinking is what could be described as dualism, and I'm going to address that in a later post on another ism. Well, what's your thinking about the coronavirus? A deist would say, well, it was an outbreak caused by scientific manipulation of a virus or an animal virus that perhaps got loose. And I hear little in church circles about seeing God's hand in all of this. Our involvement as Christians is merely trying to pray it away rather than seeing it perhaps as a word from God of correction, of judgment. Well, what is the danger of deism? Well, I think one, and perhaps most importantly, it undercuts our belief in the sovereignty of God. It doesn't attribute events to God's hand. It attributes them to natural law or to accidents, coincidence, fate, kismet, whatever. And I think number two, it obscures hearing God's voice. So when these events occur, if we don't really appreciate that God's involved, we're probably not going to be looking to hear God's voice, His direction, a message, His rebuke, if that's indeed the case, because we're simply looking at it as a natural phenomenon. And again, about this coronavirus, with a deistic view, our concern becomes our pain rather than God's purpose in all of this. Look, we are Christians. We have a different worldview, a different understanding of events and history. We know that the world is moving towards the end of this age. It's the return of Christ. When the kingdom, it's the coming of God's kingdom, where every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Where are you on this? Do you see God's hand in everything? Even if we cannot understand at the moment anyway what God might be doing? Or do we see Him when certain events like a coronavirus that God is not to be linked to something terrible like this? I know it's food for thought. I appreciate you listening, and hope you'll tune in again. Bye-bye.